Here we go. Anthony's coming on now. Let's see.
Okay.
Okay, are you on?
I'm on.
Good.
That's where we're getting the echo.
It's it's Tony.
Okay. Before we go into
Tony's.
Larry, stop.
It's your headphones.
The echo is back.
let me turn the recording off. One I call traditional paradigm and one I call inflammatory. Now, 5 to 10% of the population have allergy and irritation to mold and water damage that's primarily upper respiratory. The wheezing, sneezing, coughing, runny eyes, runny nose, that kind of stuff. And it's usually tested in a manner using spore trap air test, bulk samples, tape lifts, swabs, and it kind of measures mold in what we call the genus, the family name. And it's remediated using type of chemicals and treatments to kill mold and such. And those chemicals and methods can cause a problem with people in the other paradigm we call inflammatory. Now, people that are in the inflammatory paradigm get health effects. There's up to 37 known kind of symptoms, and they're all pretty common stuff that people in that category get. In their category, about 25 to 30% of the population are born with a certain set of genes that are in an off position. Genes are like a dimmer switch. They're on, off, or in the middle. And they're born with these particular genes off. Now, if those genes get turned on by water damage events and some other kind of issues, it keeps their bodies from getting rid of certain type of inflammagens quickly. We all have these inflammagens, we all get rid of them. But as they build up in the body, they bring these symptoms on. Some of these typical symptoms are things like brain fog, vertigo, leaky gut, all kind of stuff, joint pain, fatigue, and the kind of things we got back, like on those that responded on our questionnaire, close to half of them indicated the type of symptoms that are inflammatory, close to half of them symptoms that are more in the traditional. So some people are lucky and don't fall into either category. Some fall into one or the other. And if they're real unlucky, they can fall into both categories. They could display both type of symptoms with water damage issues. So in our testing, I'll bring up the report in a minute.
I can bring it up. I've got screen share. So when you're ready for it, I'll bring it up, Larry.
Okay, why don't you bring it up, Michelle? I want you to kind of enlarge it and then scroll down till we start the testing stuff. Keep going. All right, stop there a minute. So the way we had to present this, there's a lot of info to present. So in each area of the building that we did testing, starting from the left going to the right, particle densities, we had instruments that measure how many particles in the air per cubic meter of air. And we compared the inside particle density to the outdoor level. This gives us an idea of how functional the filtration and ventilation is. So when we see an elevation higher than the outdoor level, like 5940 compared to 4230, it gives us a tip that the filtration and ventilation combination is not running ideal in that area. In the next box to the right, fungi 10 samples are a type of test that relate more to a person's reaction to inflammatory issues, but not necessarily the traditional upper respiratory stuff. The next column to the right, fungi 10, on the supply vents, again, relate to what's on the surface of those grills on the supply vents that might be getting aerosolized into the air people breathe, that again is tied more to the inflammatory issues than the traditional. The air samples, which use spore traps in the next column to the right, I don't know if you're going to move that cursor, Michelle. Okay, those relate to traditional symptoms, the upper respiratory stuff. And the swab and the tape relate more to the traditional also, traditional also. And then we tried to do two other things. The column to the far right, at least the way they were written, the way they displayed info on the questionnaires, was that there were a large number of people in this area that seemed to say they were having health effects in the building. Additionally, in this section, like ground level county clerk's office, we wrote down visual observations that may have some information that will be useful that we're seeing in this area. And then we had a link you could click on for photos. So just my explaining how we presented this, what questions do you guys have about this presentation that you may need some interpretation from me, how to interpret? Am I coming off clear on what I'm explaining?
Yes.
Okay. So it's not simple, it gets complicated. In every area, we tested for both traditional and inflammatory, and we, based on thresholds that we know of through physicians we work with all over the country, we were able to color code some generalizations, such as unacceptable means that these levels were at or above thresholds that we know tend to create these health effects. Acceptable means that they met those criteria. So, and then we had some where they were at a tipping point that we labeled them as, potentially, they could go either way. They were right at a tipping point at the top of the thresholds. So I know there's a lot of data, a lot of information. I know it's complex, and we want to make it understandable to you so that you can make good informed decisions what you're going to be doing. And before I turn you guys over to your questions, I want to try explain one other thing. We're not at this point ready or able, if you wanted, to even go into detailed remediation plans, but let me explain treatments to indoor air quality. I want to give you a little simple scenario to think about, and then I'm going to explain the three general basic methods of corrections. So before we even get into those, the first step is to find where the sources of these issues are and how to neutralize or get rid of them or stop them from being a cause. And in the inflammatory paradigm, whether this stuff is dead or alive can affect the patient. So just using a lot of strong chemicals and stuff to kill things is not only not the answer, but it can even exacerbate their effects by the chemicals and the fumes from chemicals that are used. So there's different methods of treatment for both traditional and inflammatory. But once these sources have been found and eliminated or reduced as much as possible, the way things are treated are combinations of filtration, ventilation, and removing any dried contaminants that you don't see on surfaces through special cleaning protocols. So it gets a little complicated. And think of this too. When air flows through ductwork, wherever there are gaps or seams, surrounding air gets sucked into that airstream. And in this building, there are air handlers on levels, not on the levels they're supplying air to. So as an example, up on the top level where the old jail is, there's a few air handlers, and the air qualities up there were not great. And some of that air is getting sucked into an airstream going to another level. So it gets complex. But let me tell you about these three methods. If you picture, for example, in any one of these areas, functional areas people are working in, picture they're living in the back half of a big empty box. And halfway across the box, you have a line of air filters and air purifiers. And at the far end wall of this box, the sand stream occasionally emits, travels through the box to the other end. Now, when that sand in that stream is light or moderate in density, these air filters can take all that out of the air, and people living behind that, working behind that, are safe. When that airstream gets heavy, some of the sand gets behind the air filters and may not be at a level yet to trigger symptoms in these people that have the vulnerability to these health issues. When that airstream comes out with heavy levels, very heavy levels of sand, it can cause symptoms. Now, if we open a window on either side of that room they're working in, and put a fan in one window blowing air out, allowing air to come in the other window, we can blow the rest of the sand out, and that's called ventilation. So the key is every place, every workplace, every home has some levels of this sand. That level, the ideal, no one will ever work in or live in a place that doesn't have some of this sand, so to speak. So the sand represents the contaminants. Okay. Obviously, the air filters represent air purification. The fan represents ventilation. So to get things right, there has to be the right balance of how these things work. But the goal is to keep that sand below occupants' trigger levels if they're vulnerable to this stuff, and try keep it from having spikes that can affect them. So it has to be well thought out what to do and how to balance and what things to do first. I know we're not going into detail of remediation that's beyond our initial scope, but I want you to understand the processes involved. So ideally, that'll be helpful. So before we have discussion, do you want to go through anything more on this report, or because if not, we'll kind of close that screen so we can see each other better as we talk.
Some points if we can go on the report. I don't know, Larry, if there's some continual information you want to provide. I know you've mentioned a couple times here, three methods for remediation. We do have some general questions and also maybe some particular questions, kind of points within the report. I don't know if you want to go into that now or if you want to kind of finish.
Let's close the report and have general discussion. We can bring it back up as we need. So was there anything I talked about so far that you have questions, understanding, or thoughts on it, or?
One suggestion I'd have is when you send out the questionnaires, have them put their name on it, because like we talked about this afternoon or this morning, we have 6 or 9 employees in different departments, and you had 18 to 28 reports or questionnaires returned.
Yeah, let me grab them, and I can better answer your question. Just a minute.
But you generally, for a questionnaire like this, you generally don't want names on them, because you want people to feel free to be able to respond comfortably without fear of retaliation.
Sure.
It's usually the You know, and really it was just to get an idea of, are there health, you know, are there people that are working in the building that are experiencing health?
And I get that.
Yeah.
So here's the deal. Maybe, I don't know how many, 4, 5, 6, maybe put a name on it, but we didn't ask for a name. Our questions were: number one, floor and room description, example, ground floor, county's clerk office. So this one I'm looking at says second floor in the recording room. Second question said, do you experience any of the following to a significantly greater degree when at work as opposed to when not at work? Circle all that may apply to you, and there's a list of symptoms. 3, do you have a history of respiratory health issues, yes or no? 4, do you have a history of elevated inflammation health issues, yes or no? 5, if in your work you also go to other foreign areas in the building, do you experience any of the above symptoms when in those areas, yes or no? If yes, please describe the level of the building and area as well as the type of symptoms. Thank you for your participation. Full one staple turn into the building sheriff by January 10th or sooner. So those were the questions on the questionnaires. But I've got all those, the copy of all those that were returned to us.
I was going to say the sheriff, actually, Tony, wasn't it your office that sent those over to us? Oh, I think he has himself muted. That's okay, but I think it was Tony who sent them. So if you're wanting to see them, you should be able to get yourself a copy of those.
Thank you.
So as it turned out, roughly 70% of them, of those returned, claim they had these health issues, and of those, it was close between 40 and 50% between those that said they had health issues, between traditional and what they perceive as inflammatory. So we felt we really needed to test both type of things, you know, in the building that might trigger one or the other or both. So, you know, there's an issue, and, you know, I'm going to think that as you approach solutions, to try things a step at a time as soon as you're able, and try do things that may tend to get you the most bang for the buck first, and correlate with you know, the employees, how it's going.
Larry, a couple of questions on what you had talked about on the inflammatory.
Yeah.
It's traditional. How are you, I know you were talking about the fungi 10 and, you know, your wipe samples are more on the inflammatory side and the purpose of that. How are those individuals getting exposed to those inflammatory versus your traditional respiratory? Are you saying it's contact?
I'm sorry, the last word or two I didn't get.
Are you saying it's contact related?
No, here's how it works. Think of this. When mold grows, or any of these other biological life forms that grow on building materials, cellulose, paper, carpet, all of that stuff, as they grow, they metabolize. Names of molds, like, for example, Aspergillus, whatever, they're called the genus. They're a family of molds. As they grow, they eat what they grow on. They need moisture to help dissolve the food source to go up roots into their cells. Now, when they have that ability and they're actually growing and metabolizing, they morph into variations called species that have two names. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is at the species level, each species during metabolism creates specific chemicals that identify with their species that they use to fight microscopic warfare with themselves for domination of the area. So while that goes on, a mold is growing, these chemicals that are created on these species emit in the air, and they attach to dust, walls, personal property and structure, and dry. When they dry, they're not mold and they're not alive. They're dry chemicals. Now, when those get disturbed in the air by air movements, temperature changes, mechanical vibration, those chemicals get in the air people breathe and cause these inflammatory symptoms. So, I mean, that's kind of the long and short of it. Additionally, on dead or live spores that get in the air that may have some of these dry chemicals on their surface can also bring on the inflammatory symptoms as well as traditional symptoms. It's more the spores that create the upper respiratory issues, but what's on their surface may also, induce inflammatory. I don't know if that answers it good enough for it.
I was going to say, I think the other important piece is that they're invisible. You can't see them. And everybody's taking them in. Everybody's immune system becomes activated as you take in these toxins that Larry described. Those of you who don't have health effects who are working in the building, your immune system is functioning as it should. Your immune system becomes activated. Your body metabolizes these toxins, you excrete them, and you go along your merry way. For those who are having difficulty and having health issues, they're taking in that toxin. Their immune system becomes activated, but they're slow or have difficulty metabolizing these toxins. So their immune system goes into hyper overdrive, creating a chronic state of inflammation, which causes all these multi-system, multi-symptoms. So it's not like those who aren't affected, aren't also taking in these toxins. The immune system is just acting appropriately. It's an immune system, wouldn't you say, dysfunction?
It's actually in a category of the immune system called the innate immune system. It's complicated, but that's a good explanation, Michelle. Thank you.
So any other questions as it relates to?
Listen, I know this is more info than you ever wanted to know.
When you're
We're not trying to make it hard for you guys.
Yeah, Larry, when you're talking about earlier, you had said 3 approaches to the remediation side of things. And of course, when you look at it, you think you're giving off the chemicals, like you had said, from the surface growth, but also giving off spores. So I'm assuming your approach is to, I don't think you dove into the 3 different stages of what your remediation approach. I know it's just a generalization, but once you get to the source, then aren't you taking care of both?
Well, eliminating the source stops it from getting worse, but it doesn't remove what was created by what happened previously. So, for example, there's still these plated out chemicals you don't see on surfaces of walls, carpeting, and all. So, like typically a remediation company might come in and they typically want to use strong chemicals we call fungicides to kill mold, and they think that's the whole deal. And that can be more problematic because those chemicals can cause reactions in the inflammatory. And if the stuff's dead already, cleaning it isn't the answer. Killing it isn't the answer because it can affect the people alive or dead. So the solution is more in either removing or surfactantly cleaning surfaces to get rid of these things. So, there's a huge amount of surfaces in the building. So it's going to involve, without getting into specific details, combinations of some cleaning, some improvements in air purification, maybe some ways to improve ventilation, getting rid of some of the items and areas that, may be sources. I know, we're not giving you a total remediation plan. It would take some work in really putting that all together. I want you to understand the concepts because it'll help you in your thinking how to go about this. You definitely are going to need some solutions.
I was reading some stuff on CDC about like houseplants in the building could be a cause of some of the problems. Would you agree on that?
We're finding the house plants in general. Here's the risk. I don't think in general they're a major contributor, but here's the deal. You want to make sure they sit on some kind of a base that collects the water safely when they're watered, that it doesn't go through to carpeting or floor below the pots. Secondly, we see sometimes mold growth on the stems of some of the plants. The soils, even though it's just the surface of the soils, don't pose that much of a problem. One of the key national physician leaders we work with has a strong opinion that houseplants in general aren't a major cause, but you just have to be careful with them.
Do you think houseplants played a role in the levels that are here at the courthouse?
They could have.
I doubt that they're a major contributor.
Okay.
Is any remediation program going to cause the courthouse to be shut down for a period of time while the remediation is going on?
In thinking about that, unfortunately, it becomes problematic for this reason. Even if you wanted to say shut down a level at a time and do the remediation, you've got air coming into some of these areas from other levels while you're doing that. So that creates a problem. So I think if the HVAC distribution of air were mapped out carefully on each level, there could maybe be ways of shutting down certain areas at a time and containing them during the remediation. But then the problem is when you open it up, air from other areas can come back in and start to recontaminate. So it's got to be thought out very carefully how to go about it. Obviously, these are critical functions that take place in this building. I mean, they have to go on. So there's got to be a way to think it through how to do this in a safe manner. For example, if there were remediation and it could be done a level at a time, we'd recommend lowest levels first because the air rises from lower levels up. So you don't want to do an upper level and then have it contaminated by a lower level. But we need much more definition on the pathways of the HVAC systems. That's going to be a major key in how to figure out how to solve this.
Larry, you mentioned that about the air handlers up in the jail. The three air handlers are up in the jail. The outside air comes from one huge piece of ductwork and then it distributes to the other three.
Yeah.
And if you're saying, if I heard you right, that if you have a little small crack in your ductwork or something like that, there's a chance for some air that's actually in the room to get sucked in there. Is that correct?
Yeah, even the junctions of the ductwork, if they're not properly sealed by a compound or duct tape, allow surrounding air to get sucked into that traveling stuff in the duct. And I believe it was on that level that we saw, interior insulation in some of the plenums. We didn't have scopes to go into all the ductwork, but we find that the interior insulation, a lot of that insulation has urea formaldehyde binder on the pieces of fiberglass and all that are like junk food for microbial growth. So when you have air moving over that kind of insulation, creates a problem. So also in the air handlers, the blades of the blower fan and the housing of the blower fan, and if there's air conditioning evaporator coils, like we have protocols and all on how to clean those. I mean, I think, the air handling system is going to be a big key to all of this. if I were in your guys' shoes, I probably want to start with, analyzing the HVAC systems, the ductwork, and making first steps in those directions. Also, sources and rooms, if you read through the visuals in the report, it kind of tells about things that we're seeing in each area. Some of those things may be clues as to areas that could be sources. I think there were a few rooms that maybe had some maybe water damage on carpeting or something in their history, things of that nature.
Larry, when you looked at this, was there one area that stuck out to you the most? You mentioned start with the biggest bang for your buck. What would you think that would be based on what you went over?
You know how to ask the really tough questions.
You want me to pull up the
I'd
report?
have to review it all, but let me tell you this. I think some of the unoccupied areas, like the jail level, there were a lot of bad stuff, highly bad stuff in those areas. And the key would be to try eliminate any air movement, either through the HVAC or otherwise, from that level to the rest of the building. I can't fully answer your question. I have to review the entire report to a degree.
That's all right. I just want to know if something stuck out in your head.
What sticks out to me is also, I think on the level below the jail level, there were some prior jail areas that were uninhabited. What is it, level 4, I guess, where you count the ground level as the first level. There was kind of a large area where there were some holding areas for prisoners, so to speak, where there were a lot of bad air in those areas and a lot of bad stuff on walls. So maybe as far as cleanups, prioritizing those areas would be helpful. Even if you could air seal all air pathways from the jail levels to the rest of the air in the building would be helpful.
I can start digging into a bunch of questions.
Go ahead.
Just go ahead. Larry, was there anything else you wanted to generally explain or go over before we dive into some of the more detailed questions?
No, I wanted to give you an overview of this whole science and how it relates, so that you can.
I was going to say, the thing that's sticking out to me, and it's the science of all of it. Maybe it's something that we don't need to, but there's quite a bit of stachybotrys as it related to the dust sampling, so throughout the building, and then a lot of Aspergillus penicillium. And when we're talking about source, Larry, is there anything relevant that
Yeah,
the
definitely.
productions of those two things, as it relates, they try to correct things?
These type of mold species Michelle's talking about require 90 to 95% water activity on a food source to grow. And they create particular chemicals, and when they go in the air, we call these chemicals mycotoxins. You've probably heard the term. And the specific mycotoxins created by Stachybotrys and Chaetomium are those that are more virulent in causing patient reactions. So it kind of tells us two things: that there was a higher level, that there were presence of these everywhere. I mean, most buildings we check have little to no Stachybotrys unless there's been, water. Like Stachy requires 95% water activity on a food source to grow. Food sources are things like carpeting, paper on drywall, all that kind of stuff.
Cardboard boxes,
Yeah. It requires a little more time, as well as enough water. And it tells us, there's been a history of water to that degree to cause that. And by the way, I think that basement boiler area was another area in the building I thought was particularly worse than some other areas. Yes.
There's an area where there's a lot of like boxes with papers and things like that, which is, when it becomes wet, it just is, it's
Yeah.
a buffet for these kinds of molds to grow.
Yep.
That is in the basement where the old corner files are.
Yep.
That wall is underground. And those old books in there, we can't get rid of. We're not
Can
supposed
they be moved into like airtight plastic bins instead of paper,
Some kind of sealed container.
cardboard?
I mean, these things date way back in the early 1900s.
Yep.
Right.
Somebody just had to tell us what to do with them.
Well, I mean,
You can't destroy them.
consider either storing them off site in a different building in a sealed area, or see if there's a way to seal them, or
Digitalized.
more
yeah.
challenging method would be to seal air pathways and or try to create air pressure differentials to keep the air from moving up from that level upward. But there's various alternatives to look at with that.
The big problem is how they're stored. So they're stored in a food source when there's moisture.
So keeping moisture, relative humidity between 40 to 60% would be most ideal if you could monitor and control that. Some of these mold species can grow without free water with just high enough moisture on paper products and stuff like that.
Hey, Larry, I got a question. Our air handlers, we pump 44-degree water through each air handler to it. And then that combines with the outside air to give it its air conditioning. Okay. Underneath there is a condensate pan. And
Okay.
that's going to have some water sitting in it because then it goes through the drain on out. Are you saying that that's the way that the system is set up now, the way that the building was built in 1950, that's part of the problem?
Well, I mean, that's a pretty typical, I mean, even today, evaporator coils for air conditioning and a supply plenum are pretty much the same deal. They're going to get condensation on them in the heat transfer. It's going to drip in a drip pan that usually connects with a hose to a drain. And I mean, there's protocols we have like on a regular basis, at the end of each season, how to clean those coils with safe materials, how to clean the pan and the plenum surfaces, how to clean the fan blades of the blower fan, but that can be controlled.
Well, Larry, if you didn't have any other general comments, I had a few questions to follow up with you.
Sure.
I know you were on your acceptable, not acceptable on a lot of these different things. A lot of it's based on some background sampling. When you're doing your surfaces and vent samples for your fungi 10, we noticed that you had a comparison to what I think is called an H2 value.
Oh, okay. That's the hurts me score, I think.
Yep.
Michelle.
And so we saw a lot of times where unacceptable was given, but it didn't match up with the H2 value.
Let me explain that, as I think you're asking that. About, I don't know how many years ago, this physician who created some of the inflammatory medical processes for inflammatory patients created this test called Hurts Me. It's a medical acronym, strange name, Hurts Me. And it involves, in this fungi 10, there's 10 species of mold in it. 5 of them are the 5 that are used in calculating a Hertzme score. The other 5 are out of group 1 of what's called an ERMI, an Environmental Residential Moldiness Index. And those other 5 also create, we know now, create mycotoxin chemicals that can affect symptoms in these people. Now, in the Hertzme, this physician who created this score, he and a colleague studied 822 patients who were treated for their illness and re-entered their homes. And the correlation he found was if the Hertzme score were 0 through 10, the average relapse rate of those 822 patients was 1.7%, not bad. If that Hertzme score were 10 to 15, the average relapse rate climbed pretty swiftly to 47%. And if that Hertzme score were over 15, the correlation jumped rapidly to over 90% relapse rate. So that Hertzme score tells us a number of different things. Not only does it tell us how good or bad this is by the correlation I just explained, but when we look at the 5 species concentrations, and we know each species is either a xerophilic that doesn't require much moisture to grow, like 2 of the species in the 5. 2 of them are hydrophilic that need a high level of moisture to grow. 1 of them is kind of in the middle. So when we look at that, it kind of gives us an idea of current or history of the degree of moisture or water in the area. And sometimes because, I mean, if you had a large basement area, we could tell by the concentration of these Hertzme species to what degree stuff could be coming in from air mixed in soils due to negative pressure in the building and stack effect. It gets a little more complicated, but the Hertzme info and the test give us a lot of info that it helps us detect areas of sources, as well as, you know, how good or bad it is for an inflammatory person. Believe me, I get it. This is so much more than you ever wanted to know.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to have to.
Well, it
this
just
stuff.
it seems like there's not a direct correlation of when all of a sudden acceptable is not acceptable or potentially acceptable. And so if we're
Well,
trying
the Hertzme scores are, I'd say, no higher than 10 to 12, maybe 13 at the outside. They're basically acceptable. If they're higher than that, we consider them not acceptable. Michelle, do you agree that's?
Well, if it's the Hertzme, when we were looking at the fungi 10, here I'm going to pull up just to give you kind of an example. This is a set of samples, your second floor surface samples, right? So if we're just looking at the Hertzme scores, let's look at room 2D, for example, jury room. That Hertzme score of 8, if we were just looking at the Hertzme on that fungi 10, that would be acceptable. But we're looking at the whole fungi 10 and the 10 molds. So let me see if I can move this out of the way and make it bigger for you guys. All these stuff is always in my wrong place on my screen.
we can see it okay.
You can see it okay?
Yep.
So here's courtroom 2D. The mycotoxin that Larry was talking about, there's 5 other molds that aren't part of the Hertzme. There's Aspergillus flavus that produces the mycotoxin aflatoxin, had elevations. This Aspergillus penicilliotis is part of the Hertzme, so that was elevated. Stachybotrys, that's really a high level of Stachybotrys here of 82.
It tells us there's been a lot of water activity, either current or historic, in that area.
Okay.
And then Wallemia. So you have these 4 areas where mycotoxins are being produced, even though that Hertzme score was an 8. So the fungi 10 goes beyond just your Hertzme.
Yeah. Do you put more relevance into the Hertzme or the other one Larry was explaining, where it was just an individual that there's some correlation?
I'm not sure I understand what we're comparing hurts me to.
Yeah, you had said one of them is the hurts me, which just has the 5, and the
Yeah.
other one concluded all 10. And what did you call that again?
The fungi 10.
Yeah, but you said there was a study done on those that to have a
The
correlation.
study was done on the hurts me's, but here's the deal. Look on the very left column here, where it says species mycotoxin.
Mhm.
The first 4 of these are not in the hurts me. But then these particular mycotoxins, if you look at the 3rd and 4th one down, this Aspergillus niger and ocratius, they both create a chemical called ochratoxin. So in a lot of patients, inflammatory patients, their physicians have them take a mycotoxin urine test. There's a couple labs, Great Plains labs, Vibrant labs. In virtually almost every one of these lab reports we see, every one of these inflammatory patients have elevated levels of ochratoxin A. So we know that those 2 are definitely important in symptoms of an inflammatory patient. We know the gliotoxin and aflatoxin also show up in their urine. And the Penicillium brevicompactum, took me a week to say that word without stumbling, but 3rd from the bottom, that one creates that mycophenolic acid, also shows up heavily in the urine of the patients that are reacting to this stuff. So we know those 5, beside what this physician who developed hurts me, that the hurts me alone isn't the whole story. So with less money than an ERMI test would cost to get this info, the fungi 10 gives us these 10, of most concern for less cost than the ERMI test. That's one of the reasons we like it a lot.
Yeah.
It gives us more of what we need for less cost. Look at that small jury room 2C on the lower left. No, there you go, Michelle. The Aspen requires only 59 to 60% moisture on a food source to grow. That's a much higher level than we usually see.
I think the other thing to notate that was, of concern is that the preponderance throughout the building of Stachybotrys, and Stachybotrys is,
look at storage area 2Z.
Yeah. It's probably a storage box is probably, yeah.
Of all the hundreds and hundreds of clients we do work with, we rarely see stachy much over 5. Sometimes we see it maybe 20 or 30. But some of these numbers are incredibly high compared to usual. But when
so compare, explain the 2, why 130 is really concerning compared to the 11,260, right? So a lot of times people think, well, that's much lower. The Stachybotrys is much lower at 130. But explain that, I think maybe that as far as
even the scoring in the hurts me, the gigs in developing the hurts me scores start at much lower levels on the Stachy and Chetomium, which starts with CHAET, than the Aspen. So we know that the chemicals created by Stachy and Chetomium are much more virulent for the people that are vulnerable than some of the mycotoxins from some of these with higher concentrations. So we pay particular weight on the Stachy and Chetomium.
No, I would agree with that, Larry. And Michelle, sorry, I keep leaving you out, Michelle, too. Thank you.
That's okay. That's all right.
It's just when we're trying to have to explain this to different individuals, we'll be on one side of the fence of, is it as really bad as it looks? And others are trying to make it look worse than it is. You've been here, you've done that. And so when we can say that, hey, there is the hurts me, and that's something that's been proven versus, well, we've seen it showing up in urine samples or other things. The hurts me is something we can put in front of somebody that we can do better. And so that's where the correlation, if you're saying, well, that seems to bear more weight,
Yep.
which in my mind it does. I'm not discounting that some of these that aren't in the hurts me shouldn't be counted. But when you're trying to talk to both sides that are wanting the other's extreme, what can we really rely on? And the hurts me seems to be it.
If you're looking just at the hurts me, so I mean, this is giving you here. So a hurts me score of 10 and under, is that acceptable? So of that second floor, this is surface samples, right? So of the second floor, you have 2 rooms that would be considered a passing hurts me.
Yeah.
And acceptable, if you were just looking at hurts me. Am I correct, Larry? The small jury room 2G,
Yep. Yeah.
jury room for courtroom 2B, 2D.
Yeah.
And
Those-
if we look, let me
yeah.
see what those 2D and small jury room 2G. Yeah. Okay. But again, that had that 11,000. So yeah, if you're just looking at that, you'd have to look for a 10 or under.
Yeah, we noticed there were some that had like a hurts me of 8 or 6 or even lower that still
Yep.
considered unacceptable. And I know where that's coming from. Like you say, you put some weight on the others, but there's not just a defined line. So it makes it gray when you're trying to explain it to people, and we're trying to black and white it as much as possible.
It's not an easy task. I grant you that. Yeah.
Yeah, so along with that questioning, would you agree that if you did a surface sample that was, say, 10 square feet versus a first surface sample of 2 square feet, you will get a higher concentration typically?
No, not necessarily. It should be relatively homogeneous on that surface. If
Then
it's a contiguous surface.
I got a question on your sampling protocol then on those for surfaces. Were each of the surface samples equivalent in size?
They were equivalent in what appeared to be visually the amount of dust that appeared on that one sampling side of a Swiffer cloth. In other words, we had to have enough dust for the lab to run the test. So we tried to, on each sample, we tried to get maybe 8 to 10 areas in an area, in an office, say, to get the dust from, to sample various surfaces of walls and content on one cloth.
Yeah. I think the people on the end of, is this as bad as it looks? Could see some questions. Well, if you have one of your samplers that were on site went into a room and said, well, I got enough dust on this cloth, but then they went to another room and said, hey, I got a bunch of areas I really think there's an issue. Could there have been a higher concentration because of how they approached it?
That's a possibility. But let me throw out this thought. When you guys have this meeting tomorrow, you're going to get some questions you may not feel real sure about how to answer. If you want to take those down and maybe come back, that we could help give you answers and come back to them again with the answers, as opposed to punting, to the degree we can, we'll try and assist you with that if you want to.
Well, greatly appreciate that, and we may have some of those. I'm trying to be able to get enough answers from you, so we may not have as many for you after that meeting. And when I look at this, I think it'd be hard to explain. Yeah, let's just say there's a person that's at this meeting that has an unacceptable in their room, and they're going to focus on that very heavily.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be difficult for us to say, well, we don't know if they took a 2 square foot sample or if they took a 30 square foot sample in your area. So we're gonna have to go back and figure that out.
But know this, the samples we ran and the way we ran them should be fairly representative of the air quality in that work area.
Do you have a standard sampling procedure for those wipe samples that you could share. So when you get into the details of some of those questions, it may be good to understand, because like I said, some of them maybe we don't feel are as acceptable as what maybe you do, but maybe it's because we don't know what we're talking about.
On each sampling cloth, we try to get 10 to 12 or so collections on surfaces of different areas in the work area to give us more of a picture that is more homogeneous of what may come off those surfaces into the breathable air. So it's not just from one area, it's a sampling in the area. And the things that make these things go off surfaces into the breathable air in steady state conditions are air movement, temperature changes, air pressure changes, mechanical disturbances that make these things go in the air. And they could come off from, randomly off different surfaces. So we try gather from numerous surfaces of different kind of content and structure to be more representative to give homogeneity to it.
Isn't it the net effect of really what has played it out in that area?
Yeah.
I'm not disagreeing with that procedure of wanting to get a representative for that
Yeah.
Area or occupied space, but it's hard to for me to picture that they're not equivalent sampling. So if you can get a higher concentration just by an individual changing their procedure slightly from room to room, the relative comparison can lack a bit.
Yeah, and I'm not just speaking for protocols that we developed ourselves. I mean, I work with groups of colleagues in this field we're in. We've worked together like a year and a half on developing protocols, maybe 6, 8 of us nationally, and even a couple guys internationally in on this. We've tried different methods for cleaning and cleaning agents and, how we present, how we take samples. I mean, the methods we used are a consensus of a large group on a national basis of indoor environmental professionals.
Larry, I from what you're talking about, I completely agree. It sounds like you guys have done a lot of work in this area, and I'm glad you have it as an expert here. But if there's any way you could share that procedure for a surface sampling that would help us, that would be greatly appreciated. If that's something that's proprietary, we understand.
I don't know, Michelle, have we got a protocol? Yeah, we have a protocol for surface.
Well, he's looking for measurement is what I'm hearing him say. How do you know that, we need 4 milligrams of dust? He's looking for, if one has 4 milligrams, and what I'm understanding you to say is if one cloth had 4 milligrams of dust and let's say another one picked up 6 milligrams of dust, is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know sometimes you can't get the exact weight of the dust to be equivalent, but one way you can get consistency.
Here's the deal. The lab that ran these samples, they do weigh the dust. If it's less than 4, they let us know. And they let us know, usually they're somewhere between maybe 4 and 5, typically, that we see coming back on the lab test.
Are those weights shown on any of the lab results that were provided?
Yes, here, let me go back and show you. So if we go back to this sample here. So if we take a look at this this same one we were using, the second floor surface samples, the weight in milligrams of dust are very close. I mean, they're from 4.9 to 5.1. So, but here's the weight of the dust right here.
It's fairly good consistency. Does that include the weight of the cloth or just the dust?
No, just
That's
the
just the
dust.
dust.
Thank you. Next topic. I'll jump away from that one. Were the exterior samples collected or your background or control samples collected on the same day as the interior samples?
Oh, Darren will be the one to.
And the reason I ask, and maybe it's just, maybe you could provide this, the chain of custodies were not provided. At least I couldn't find them on the download. And I know the chain of custody probably would have the sample dates for each sample collected. Could you provide copies of the chain of custodies?
I think so, yeah.
I would think the days of sport trap testing, well, we had different days we were doing that.
Yeah, it was spread over several days.
Yeah, right.
And I know you took several background samples, but,
Yeah, right.
and as you well aware, you do the background samples because that can affect the interior samples as well, especially if they have makeup air coming in
Mhm.
or fresh air being put in. So, it'd be nice to know if somebody asked that question, were the samples collected on the same day? We could answer that, and we could answer that if we had the chain of custody, probably.
Do you have any definitive knowledge of what percent of makeup air is coming into the building?
10% is what we're saying.
Yeah, that's what I expected.
Um. Some of these you've already answered, so I have to skip them again. Some particular questions, I guess, on some particular sample results. If you go into the county clerk, I'm just starting at the ground floor.
Mhm.
Michelle, if you want to bring that back up.
Hang on a second. Let me find it first before I make it. Hang on. Oh, boy. Wait. So what did you want? Where do you want me to go first?
Just go to the county clerk's office.
From the report?
Yeah.
All right, hang on one
I
second.
think it's the very first one on the
Yeah, I
ground.
think it is.
I've got to get out of the labs though, and I got to get to the report. So give me a sec.
You may need a lab for that too, because I was comparing.
Oh, okay. Hang on. Let me pull this up. Share screen. All right. County clerk.
County clerks. So under the air sample, it's listed potentially unacceptable.
Mhm. It is-
So if you have the air lab result for that. The Aspergillus penicillium, 80 spores per cubic meter. My understanding is pretty low for an indoor environment. And I think the total spore count was pretty low, so we're wanting to know. Now, I'll have several questions like this, so.
Hang on, let me.
um,
You know what? It's not. Let me pull up the labs as well versus having you having to put you through all of my different tabs that are open. So give me another sec to pull up the lab, and I can oscillate between the two tabs. Okay. So here's what he's talking about here, right?
So you had a total spore count of 400. Backgrounds were typically in the average of 2,000. For total spore, and then the Aspergillus penicillium for outdoor on average. Now you had one outdoor sample that had 0.
Mhm.
Average, it was around 20. So why would this be considered potentially unacceptable?
Are you able to see this, Blair?
Yeah, I see it. So we don't know the degree of air leakiness or any potential negative pressure in that office. Generally, I mean, most of the time we see, unless there's some kind of a historic or water damage, don't see elevations of aspen in areas. And I know generally a total background, a total fungi at 2000, 0 to 2000, a lot of industrial hygienists feel is a safe level. But, you know, we need to look inside of that, whatever that total is, to see what's going on. So like at the next column over, probation offices, there was no aspen. And if we look at all the other areas, let's just see what some of the others are. Okay, treasurer's office had none. Sub-basement boiler room had none. File room had none. And they also are exposed to the same outdoor levels. There was 100 in the ITLBO, 300 exterior back near parking lot. Okay, so, you know, it was an educated comment that the fact that it had an elevation at all, you know.
It's potentially a problem. It didn't say, right? Isn't that what it was given?
Yeah, I mean, I get his point, you know. We could have maybe
Well, I think it shows that there's a slight elevation. The reason it was given a potential unacceptable was quantified with the
it's
slight.
not saying it's unacceptable. I mean, maybe it needs further look at.
Yeah, I think, so we've seen their studies, you know, we're trying to learn here as well. Where up to a 700 count of interior space for Aspergillus penicillium and air samples has generally been considered acceptable. And once you get above that, now,
Did you say 700?
yeah,
Well,
it was a residential study, and I can't remember what it was even now, but I think the average of the exterior was 200-ish for your backgrounds. And I think there are other samples within the report that have 80 and above Aspergillus, which you considered acceptable. And
I think the criteria we used, rather than is it healthy or unhealthy at that level, the fact it poked up its head says we need to maybe look if there's a cause in there that needs to be addressed or not. I think we're thinking more in that line.
Well, and you're also looking at, are there people that are saying that they're not well in that space as well?
And aside from these averages that you hear and read about, every individual that has sensitivities, you know, have different trigger levels of, you know, what level is going to trigger their symptom. They're not all identical in each person.
Mhm. Give me just a second. I want to look at one thing.
I was gonna say, I'm gonna have to go pretty soon.
Yeah. Well, I'll try to get through fast. I guess there was a couple there that I think on the air. So we're trying to make sure that an individual, say that's in the county, or that say the county clerk's office, will see this and read this potentially unacceptable. And when we look at the air samples and see where sometimes 80 on an Aspergillus penicillium is acceptable and other times it's not, I know you're trying to take other factors into consideration, like the number of respondents, the health effect. But it seems like there's this overly gray area of when things are acceptable and not acceptable. And it's nice when we can say, like I was getting to the questions on hurts me, you know, that has some study behind it. So those numbers make sense. You know, comparing the outside air makes sense, especially if it's taken on the same day of the sample. But there are some concentrations, again, that just seem inconsistent through the report.
Yeah, it might be interpreted that it means, a more critical look in these areas needs to be made. But,
There was, I think the assessments, the very next one down, Michelle, well, it's up there on the top portion, potentially unacceptable. The total, and that's for the air sample I'm looking at, the total spore concentration was 80, which is really low for an interior space.
but our concern is more, why is it there? Was there something that occurred historically in that area to cause that? We just feel it needs a closer look at that. I get where you're going, and I understand and agree with that, your aspects.
Yeah, it's,
I guess in a way, maybe we feel like there should be a side note separate to that, instead of it saying potentially unacceptable, because then that's all anybody that has an issue will look at.
Yeah, I
Should
get
be a
where
side
you're going.
note. It should be acceptable with a side note.
the air sample, just looking at it by itself was acceptable, but this area, because maybe it's the questionnaire or your wipe samples had something else to do with it, but when an 80 total spore count for an interior space is, dang near zero. I think that's only 2 spores showed up on the
But
sample.
if you want to explain that to your group tomorrow and tell them that, we had this discussion and we agree with that, you can do that.
Okay.
Well, I'm just gonna, to give you a food for thought with all of that is that they all, in taking a look at everything, we have elevated mycotoxin levels on the fungi 10. You have another elevated mycotoxin in that supply vent. You have the presence of Chitomium and Aspergillus on swab samples. So, doesn't all of that, Larry?
Yeah, well, we were talking about spore test. In these other areas, I agree, Michelle.
Okay.
The fact Chitomium, is elevated in there, that's a big deal. That means there's been water damage.
Yeah, I think, as I've thought about this and looked at the report, and if I guess take a view from my side here for just a second, I look at some of these on the fungi 10 and they're not consistent, meaning that it's not the hurts me, it doesn't line up with the hurts me, but that's the one we can go off of. There's an air sample with a total spore count of 80 that's considered potentially unacceptable. And if I've got to explain to an occupant of a certain area that maybe we don't agree, but we're not the expert, but we don't agree that, based on what we're looking at in your report, that there are maybe some not quite consistent responses. We're a little nervous about how we're going to get some reactions from that. And I don't know.
Let me interrupt a minute, Michelle. Go up in the report just a tiny bit. Scroll it. Stop there. Wait, stop there, please. If you look at the visual section in this same area, it says, and it's in bold, there's a standalone air purifier running in this office, which means that without that elevation is probably going to be higher than we see it in the test.
I do understand that. And I think that potentially could happen, but unless you guys checked the air purifier to see if it's
I get it. Yeah, I understand.
it's
But-
clogged, it's
But
maybe
also in these visuals, there's some good clues about, where things need to be dealt with, We're
Yeah.
talking about, random staining on ceiling tiles. Obviously, those should be replaced. I mean, there's all kind of clues on these visuals that'll be helpful in how you deal with this.
Just since we're talking about a side note, I did notice on, it was a third floor public defenders. There's an air sample listed as potentially unacceptable, but then I think one of your bold comments maybe was there were two open windows saying pushing air into the office. And that sample is very close to the background sample.
Mhm.
You know, I
Yeah.
think there was another room where there were windows open and you guys decided not to sample. So just some things that were noted.
Yeah, guy. Yeah, that's good. Good info.
I know, Michelle, you probably need to you said you needed to get going.
I do. I've got a lot. I need to accomplish it tonight. I didn't realize this was gonna be, it's almost 9.
Yeah. Yeah, they've got a lot of individuals to talk to about this, and as you guys are well aware, there's a lot of occupants with high standing in the community, so we want to be able to answer their questions well. We appreciate you taking a couple hours here. And Larry, this may be a question for you. So Michelle, if you want to jump off after with that, but
Thank you, Michelle.
I know you aren't, your scope is not part of right now, part of remediation. But when we do want to take to the public whether to move forward with the next scope of services from you guys, I want to be able to answer a couple questions to them.
Sure.
And you hopefully these aren't too tough questions, kind of putting you on the spot here. But
It won't be the first time. No worries.
Will the proposed remediation guarantee that upon remediation, the confirmation samples will be acceptable levels?
There are no guarantees. The best we can do if we're involved is to come up with reasonable solutions. And things would probably be, we would recommend whoever you work with to do things a step at a time and try deal first with things that may tend to get you the most bang for the buck and kind of monitor the results of that to see if you need to go further or do more. But there's no way anybody in this field can guarantee the outcomes. So in making decisions what to do, you know, we can maybe give ideas on how successful each of these things might be. But especially as the size and scope of a building increases, and you have multiple HVAC systems and multiple levels, it just, you know, increases the risk of it maybe not being good enough. So think of that analogy with the sand. We're never going to get rid of all the sand, but we want to get it at low enough levels that people don't react, you know, physically to its presence. So the best you can do is all the things that you can physically do within cost parameters to get it as good as you can get it. And I know this, we've seen greatest success where besides removing sources, combinations of purification and ventilation, we've seen the most success getting to the answer you want, that it's going to do the job.
Yeah, and part of that's tied into the question I had before about you had a potentially unacceptable with a total spore count of 80. I don't think you're going to get this building down to a total spore count.
No, I agree with you. I agree with that.
Yeah. So I'm assuming, and you don't have to tell us what those are, but I'm assuming if you, in your remediation, you will be able to define to the remedial contractor what's going to be considered acceptable? Like what you're going to do to prove it's acceptable?
Yeah, in fact, I want to throw one other zinger in here that could be used if needed. I'm in a study with one of the national physicians of a device now that can take a grab air sample anywhere from 1 to 5 days. And it can actually, we can get results, not just at the genus level, but the spore level of Stachy, Chaetomium, and Cladosporium in the air over that time period. We can get a weight measurement of something called beta glucans, which I'm not trying to confuse you with something new, in picograms per cubic meter of air that have an incredible sensitivity to mold levels. They're in cell walls of molds and bacteria that get in the air. The reason we want to study this is to see if doing various remediations and treatments, how the health outcomes before and after the cleaning and remediation, if there's a causality or a correlation with beta glucans. You don't need that. We can also measure 2 to 3 levels of mycotoxins in the air over like a 1 to 5 day grab sampling of air. You could do spore trap air testing after remediation, which will give some pretty strong clues. After the cleanup, there's going to be hard to find enough dust to do qPCR testing like fungi 10 test. So if you wanted to do that in a post setting, you'd have to have designated areas that have been cleaned to continue to sample dust over weeks with the same sampling cloth till you get enough dust on it to run a test that would correlate with what's in the air one have been breathing over that time period of collection. I mean, the majority of our clients don't even do post-testing. It's kind of like canary in the coal mine, come back in and, see how, if you react or not. But we've had high correlation of good results, but I mean, there's no way to know we're going to get that sandstorm as low as we need to get it by a remediation. You can do the best you can, but if you can get the right amount of ventilation properly, and it's as close to the magic bullet as we can find. I wish I had more absolute answers for you, but the basic answer to your question is, there's no one on this earth right now that can or will guarantee the result will be what you want.
Maybe
You had another question.
yeah, and you kind of already answered it, but I want to make sure. On your mold remediation protocol for the next scope of work that we'll be considering, is that going to address moisture intrusion, high relative humidity, the sources, or is it going to address just cleaning what's growing and visible?
If we were involved in this, I think we would first, in priority, want to try address how to correct sources that are causing the problem. That could be something even like, those files down in that sub-basement area, how to deal. I mean, just their presence is a source. Some of the areas that have carpeting that have been wet, we may recommend, and we have specific protocols, how to safely remove that without the manipulation, putting a lot of bad stuff back into the air. I mean, the stuff gets a little detailed. Yeah. So there would be a number of corrective things we'd be recommending for remediators to do and how to do it in safe manners.
I guess, Larry, just to maybe clarify my question, take an example you were just talking about, some boxes in a lower area that may be a source. If they put boxes down there again, what's causing and mold to grow again? Is any of your remediation protocol going to address?
Yeah, so for example, if you can control relative humidity between 40 and 60%, ideally 40 to 50 to 55, and you can control preventing additional intrusions of water and our humidity levels that won't allow condensation to occur, there won't be new mold growth.
But you'll just be addressing the source and then giving recommendations for them, like low humidity, building envelope review, condensation area review.
Well, we would try get into specifics of how to remove or remediate or clean surfaces. Where this is going to get really hairy is to handle this inflammatory paradigm is going to require a protocol called small particle cleaning of surfaces of walls and content. And it's labor intensive. It's not rocket science. It has to be done in a specific manner. For example, when the cleaning cloth gets dry, you put it in a bag to recycle and take a new one so you don't wipe an area B, which you picked up in area A. And the remediation firm that's going to do this stuff is going to be very labor intensive and costly. With a lot of our clients, we've even recommended even training a good house cleaning service to do that particular work at a lower hourly rate. So, I mean, we want to get things done right for the least cost and effort, but we have to keep getting it right and focus and, trying to target the things that will get the most bang for the buck. So whoever you work with on remediation plan, you want to be careful, you want to get it done right, you want methods to get the least cost to do it. And even then, you'll get these proposals and figure, how are we going to get funds to handle all this? How are we going to do this? It's going to get a little hairy.
You've painted such a nice, bright picture for us. Thank you.
Listen, I wish this were a lot simpler and easier. We really like jobs that have easy, simple corrections and outcomes. So this is a challenge for us as well as you guys, but you're paying us. We have to tell you how we see it, how it is.
Absolutely.
Sure. Well, anybody have anything else?
You probably do, but I think we got to put a stop on it for now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But don't be afraid to take me up on it. If you guys get grilled beyond what you can give realistic, reasonable answers to tomorrow, take note of them and get back to us. And you can tell your crowd that you'll get answers and get back to them. I don't want you to kind of fly by the seat of your pants on this stuff.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Appreciate it very much. Been very professional and you've always answered or been in contact with one of us and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, listen, I personally get concerned in every job we do. I try put myself in the shoes of my client, and think the way they do and understand their parameters, their abilities. And sometimes we have to tweak the recommended protocols or methods to do the best you can for the bucks you got and hope for the best. And very often that works. So, but if you think of that box in the sand, it kind of helps keep in perspective how we have to go through things. But I find combinations of purification and ventilation are really key. Ventilation might be more of a challenge, but I think a high priority is going to be not just on cleaning and all that stuff, but the distribution systems through the ductwork and the HVAC systems are going to be a huge piece of this.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I can't guarantee you. I don't have a magic wand and I don't walk on water, but our track record's fairly good. So I've enjoyed meeting with you guys and I'm glad I could try help demystify this stuff. I know where you're coming from and believe me, I know you never wanted to even learn this stuff. So I get it.
Okay. I guess we'll sign off now and we'll be back in contact with any questions and we appreciate it.
Great. My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Have a good evening. Take
You
care.
too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.